Chapters 15 and 16 of Don Quixote, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Craig Allen. Don Quixote, Volume 2, by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Translated by John Ormsby. Chapter 15. Wherein it is told and known who the Knight of the Mirrors and his squire were. Don Quixote went off satisfied, elated, and vainglorious in the highest degree at having won a victory over such a valiant knight as he fancied him of the mirrors to be, and one from whose knightly word he expected to learn whether the enchantment of his lady still continued, inasmuch as the said vanquished knight was bound, under the penalty of ceasing to be one, to return and render him an account of what took place between him and her. But Don Quixote was of one mind, he of the mirrors of another, for he just then had no thought of anything but finding some village where he could plaster himself, as has been said already. The history goes on to say that when the bachelor Samson Carrasco recommended Don Quixote to resume his knight-errantry, which he had laid aside, it was in consequence of having been previously in conclave with the curate and the barber on the means to be adopted to induce Don Quixote to stay at home in peace and quiet, without worrying himself with his ill-starred adventures. At which consultation it was decided by the unanimous vote of all, and on the special advice of Carrasco, that Don Quixote should be allowed to go, as it seemed impossible to restrain him, and that Samson should sally forth to meet him as a knight-errant, and do battle with him, for there would be no difficulty about a cause, and vanquish him, that being looked upon as an easy matter, and that it should be agreed and settled that the vanquished was to be at the mercy of the victor. Then, Don Quixote being vanquished, the bachelor knight was to command him to return to his village and his house, and not quit it for 2 years, or until he received further orders from him. All which it was clear Don Quixote would unhesitatingly obey, rather than contravene or fail to observe the laws of chivalry, and during the period of his seclusion he might perhaps forget his folly, or there might be an opportunity of discovering some ready remedy for his madness. Carrasco undertook the task, and Tom Cecial, a gossip and neighbor of Sancho Panza's, a lively and feather-headed fellow, offered himself as his squire. Carrasco armed himself in the fashion described, and Tom Cecial, that he might be known by his gossip when they met, fitted on over his own natural nose the false masquerade one that had been mentioned. And so they followed the same route Don Quixote took, and almost came up with him in time to be present at the adventure of the cart of death, and finally encountered them in the grove, where all that the sagacious reader has been reading about took place. And had it not been for the extraordinary fancies of Don Quixote, and his conviction that the bachelor was not the bachelor, Señor Bachelor would have been incapacitated forever from taking his degree of licentiate, all through not finding nests where he thought to find birds. Tom Cecial, seeing how ill they had succeeded, and what a sorry end their expedition had come to, said to the bachelor, "Sure enough, Señor Samson Carrasco, we are served right. It is easy enough to plan and set about an enterprise, but it is often a difficult matter to come well out of it. Don Quixote a madman, and we sane. He goes off laughing safe and sound, and you are left sore and sorry. I'd like to know now which is the matter, he who is so because he cannot help it, or he who is so because of his own choice." To which Samson replied, "The difference between the two sorts of madmen is that he who is so, will he nil he, will be one always, while he who is so of his own accord can leave off being one whenever he likes." "In that case," said Tom Cecial, "I was a madman of my own accord when I volunteered to become your squire, and, of my own accord, I'll leave off being one and go home." "That's your affair," returned Samson, "but to suppose that I am going home until I have given Don Quixote a thrashing is absurd, and it is not any wish that he may recover his senses that will make me hunt him out now, but a wish for the sore pain I am in with my ribs won't let me entertain more charitable thoughts." Thus discoursing, the pair proceeded until they reached a town where it was their good luck to find a bone setter, with whose help the unfortunate Samson was cured. Tom Cecial left him and went home, while he stayed behind meditating vengeance. And the history will return to him again at the proper time, so as not to omit making merry with Don Quixote now. Chapter 16. Of what befell Don Quixote with a discreet gentleman of La Mancha. Don Quixote pursued his journey in the high spirits, satisfaction, and self-complacency already described, fancying himself the most valorous knight-errant of the age in the world because of his late victory. All the adventures that could befall him from that time forth he regarded as already done, and brought to a happy issue. He made light of enchantments and enchanters. He thought no more of the countless drubbings that had been administered to him in the course of his knight-errantry, nor of the volley of stones that had levelled half his teeth, nor of the ingratitude of the galley slaves, nor of the audacity of the Angesians, and the shower of stakes that fell upon him. In short, he said to himself, that could he discover any means, mode, or way of disenchanting his lady Dulcinea, he would not envy the highest fortune that the most fortunate knight-errant of yore ever reached or could reach. He was going along entirely absorbed in these fancies, when Sancho said to him, "Isn't it odd, Señor, that I have still before my eyes that monstrous, enormous nose of my gossip, Tom Cecial?" "And dost thou then believe, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "that the Knight of Mirrors was the bachelor Carrasco, and his squire Tom Cecial thy gossip?" "I don't know what to say to that," replied Sancho. "All I know is that the tokens he gave me about my own house, wife, and children, nobody else but himself could have given me, and the face, once the nose was off, was the very face of Tom Cecial, as I have seen it many a time in my town and next door to my own house, and the sound of the voice was just the same." "Let us reason the matter, Sancho," said Don Quixote. "Come now, by what process of thinking can it be supposed that the bachelor, Samson Carrasco, would come as a knight-errant in arms, offensive and defensive, to fight with me? Have I ever been by any chance his enemy? Have I ever given him any occasion to owe me a grudge? Am I his rival? Or does he profess arms that he should envy the fame I have acquired in them?" "Well, but what are we to say, Señor," returned Sancho, "about that knight, whoever he is, being so like the bachelor Carrasco, and his squire so like my gossip Tom Cecial? And if that be enchantment, as your worship says, was there no other pair in the world for them to take the likeness of?" "It is all," said Don Quixote, "a scheme and plot of the malignant magicians that persecute me, who, foreseeing that I was to be victorious in the conflict, arranged that the vanquished knight should display the countenance of my friend the bachelor, in order that the friendship I bear him should interpose to stay the edge of my sword and might of my arm, and temper the just wrath of my heart, so that he who sought to take my life by fraud and falsehood should save his own. And to prove it, thou knowest already, Sancho, by experience, which cannot lie or deceive, how easy it is for enchanters to change one countenance into another, turning fair into foul, and foul into fair. For it is not 2 days since thou sawest with thine own eyes the beauty and elegance of the peerless Dulcinea in all its perfection and natural harmony, while I saw her in the repulsive and mean form of a coarse country wench, with cataracts in her eyes, and a foul smell in her mouth. And when the perverse enchanter ventured to effect so wicked a transformation, it is no wonder that he affected that of Samson Carrasco and thy gossip, in order to snatch the glory of victory out of my grasp. For all that, however, I console myself, because after all, in whatever shape he may have been, I have been victorious over my enemy." "God knows what's the truth of it all," said Sancho, and knowing as he did that the transformation of Dulcinea had been a device and imposition of his own, his master's illusions were not satisfactory to him, but he did not like to reply, lest he should say something that might disclose his trickery. As they were engaged in this conversation, they were overtaken by a man who was following the same road behind them, mounted on a very handsome flea-bitten mare, and dressed in a gaban of fine green cloth, with tawny velvet facings, and a montera of the same velvet. The trappings of the mare were of the field and gineta fashion, and of mulberry colour and green. He carried a Moorish cutlass hanging from a broad green and gold baldric. The buskins were of the same make as the baldric. The spurs were not gilt, but lacquered green, and so brightly polished that, matching as they did the rest of his apparel, they looked better than if they had been of pure gold. When the traveller came up with them, he saluted them courteously, and spurring his mare, was passing them without stopping. But Don Quixote called out to him, "Gallant sir! If so be your worship is going our road, and has no occasion for speed, it would be a pleasure to me if we were to join company." "In truth," replied he on the mare, "I would not pass you so hastily, but for fear that horse might turn restive in the company of my mare." "You may safely hold in your mare, señor," said Sancho in reply to this, "for our horse is the most virtuous and well-behaved horse in the world. He never does anything wrong on such occasions, and the only time he misbehaved, my master and I suffered for it sevenfold. I say again, your worship may pull up if you like, for if she was offered to him between two plates, the horse would not hanker after her." The traveller drew rein, amazed at the trim and features of Don Quixote, who rode without his helmet, which Sancho carried like a valise in front of Dapple's pack-saddle. And if the man in green examined Don Quixote closely, still more closely did Don Quixote examine the man in green, who struck him as being a man of intelligence. In appearance he was about 50 years of age, with but few grey hairs, an aquiline cast of features, and an expression between grave and gay, and his dress and accoutrement showed him to be a man of good condition. What he in green thought of Don Quixote of La Mancha was that a man of that sort and shape he had never yet seen. He marvelled at the length of his hair, his lofty stature, the lankness and sallowness of his countenance, his armour, his bearing, and his gravity. A figure and picture such as he had not seen in those regions for many a long day. Don Quixote saw very plainly the attention with which the traveller was regarding him, and read his curiosity in his astonishment, and, courteous as he was, and ready to please everybody before the other could ask him any question, he anticipated him by saying, "The appearance I present to your worship being so strange and so out of the common, I should not be surprised if it filled you with wonder. But you will cease to wonder when I tell you, as I do, that I am one of those knights who, as people say, go seeking adventures. I have left my home, I have mortgaged my estate, I have given up my comforts, and committed myself to the arms of Fortune, to bear me whithersoever she may please. My desire was to bring to life again knight-errantry, now dead, and for some time past stumbling here, falling there, now coming down headlong, now raising myself up again. I have carried out a great portion of my design, succouring widows, protecting maidens, and giving aid to wives, orphans, and minors, the proper and natural duty of knights-errant. And therefore, because of my many valiant and Christian achievements, I have been already found worthy to make my way in print to well nigh all or most of the nations of the earth. 30,000 volumes of my history have been printed, and it is on the high road to be printed 30,000 thousands of times, if heaven does not put a stop to it. In short, to sum up all in a few words, or in a single one, I may tell you I am Don Quixote of La Mancha, otherwise called the Knight of the Rueful Countenance. For though self-praise is degrading, I must perforce sound my own sometimes, that is to say, when there is no one at hand to do it for me. So that, gentle sir, neither this horse, nor this lance, nor this shield, nor this squire, nor all these arms put together, nor the sallowness of my countenance, nor my gaunt leanness, will henceforth astonish you, now that you know who I am, and what profession I know." With these words Don Quixote held his peace, and, from the time he took to answer, the man in green seemed to be at a loss for a reply. After a long pause, however, he said to him, "You were right when you saw curiosity in my amazement, Sir Knight, but you have not succeeded in removing the astonishment I feel at seeing you. For although you say, señor, that knowing who you are ought to remove it, it has not done so. On the contrary, Now that I know, I am left more amazed and astonished than before. What! Is it possible that there are knights errant in the world in these days, and histories of real chivalry printed? I cannot realize the fact that there can be anyone on earth nowadays who aids widows, or protects maidens, or defends wives, or succors orphans. Nor should I believe it had I not seen it in your worship with my own eyes. Blessed be heaven! For by means of this history of your noble and genuine chivalrous deeds, which you say has been printed, the countless stories of fictitious knights-errant with which the world is filled, so much to the injury of morality, and the prejudice and discredit of good histories, will have been driven into oblivion. There is a good deal to be said on that point, said Don Quixote, as to whether the histories of the knights-errant are fiction or not. Why, is there anyone who doubts that these histories are false? Said the man in green. I doubt it, said Don Quixote, but never mind that just now. If our journey lasts long enough, I trust in God I shall show your worship that you do wrong in going with the stream of those who regard it as a matter of certainty that they are not true. From this last observation of Don Quixote's, the traveller began to have a suspicion that he was some crazy being, and was waiting him to confirm it by something further. But before they could turn to any new subject, Don Quixote begged him to tell him who he was, since he himself had rendered account of his station in life. To this he in the green gaban replied, I, Sir Knight of the Rueful Countenance, am a gentleman by birth, native of the village where, please God, we are going to dine today. I am more than fairly well off, and my name is Don Diego de Miranda. I pass my life with my wife, children, and friends. My pursuits are hunting and fishing, but I keep neither hawks nor greyhounds, nothing but a tame partridge or a bold ferret or two. I have 6 dozen or so books, some in our mother tongue, some Latin, some of them history, others devotional. Those of chivalry have not as yet crossed the threshold of my door. I am more given to turning over the profane than the devotional, so long as they are books of honest entertainment, that charm by their style, and attract and interest by the invention they display, though of these there are very few in Spain. Sometimes I dine with my neighbours and friends, and often invite them. My entertainments are neat and well served, without stint of anything. I have no taste for tattle, nor do I allow tattling in my presence. I pry not into my neighbours' lives, nor have I a lynx eyes for what others do. I hear mass every day. I share my substance with the poor, making no display of good works, lest I let hypocrisy and vainglory, those enemies that subtly take possession of the most watchful heart, find an entrance into mine. I strive to make peace between those whom I know to be at variance. I am the devoted servant of Our Lady, and my trust is ever in the infinite mercy of God our Lord. Sancho listened with the greatest attention to the account of the gentleman's life and occupation, and thinking it a good and holy life, and that he who led it ought to work miracles, he threw himself off Dapple, and running in haste, seized his right stirrup, and kissed his foot again and again with a devout heart, and almost with tears. Seeing this, the gentleman asked him, What are you about, brother? What are these kisses for? Let me kiss, said Sancho, for I think your worship is the first saint in the saddle I ever saw in all the days of my life. I am no saint, replied the gentleman, but a great sinner. But you are, brother, for you must be a good fellow, as your simplicity shows. Sancho went back and regained his pack-saddle, having extracted a laugh from his master's profound melancholy, and excited fresh amazement in Don Diego. Don Quixote then asked him how many children he had, and observed that one of the things wherein the ancient philosophers, who were without the true knowledge of God, placed the summum bonum, was in the gifts of nature, in those of fortune, and in having many friends and many good children. I, Señor Don Quixote, answered the gentleman, have one son, without whom perhaps I should count myself happier than I am, not because he is a bad son, but because he is not so good as I could wish. He is 18 years of age. He has been for 6 at Salamanca studying Latin and Greek, and when I wished him to turn to the study of other sciences, I found him so wrapped up in that of poetry, if that can be called a science, that there is no getting him to take kindly to the law, which I wished him to study, or to theology, the queen of them all. I would like him to be an honor to his family, as we live in days when our kings liberally reward learning that is virtuous and worthy, for learning without virtue is a pearl on a dunghill. He spends the whole day in settling whether Homer expressed himself correctly or not in such and such a line of the Iliad, whether Martial was indecent or not in such and such an epigram, whether such and such lines of Virgil are to be understood in this way or in that. In short, all his talk is of the works of these poets, and those of Horace, Persius, Juvenal, Tibullus. For of the moderns in our own language he makes no great account, but with all his seeming indifference to Spanish poetry, just now his thoughts are absorbed in making a gloss on 4 lines that have been sent him from Salamanca, which I suspect are for some poetical tournament. To all this Don Quixote said in reply, "Children, señor, are portions of their parents' bowels, and therefore, be they good or bad, are to be loved as we love the souls that give us life. It is for the parents to guide them from infancy in the ways of virtue, propriety, and worthy Christian conduct, so that when grown up they may be the staff of their parents' old age, and the glory of their posterity. And to force them to study this or that science I do not think wise, though it may be no harm to persuade them. And when there is no need to study for the sake of pane lucrando, and it is the student's good fortune that heaven has given him parents who provide him with it, it would be my advice to let him pursue whatever science they may see him most inclined to. And though that of poetry is less useful than pleasurable, it is not one of those that bring discredit upon the possessor. Poetry, gentle sir, is, as I take it, like a tender young maiden of supreme beauty, to array, bedeck, and adorn whom is the task of several other maidens, who are all the rest of the sciences, and she must avail herself of the help of all, and all derive their lustre from her. But this maiden will not bear to be handled, nor dragged through the streets, nor exposed either at the corners of the market-places, or in the closets of palaces. She is the product of an alchemy of such virtue that he who is able to practice it will turn her into pure gold of inestimable worth. He that possesses her must keep her within bounds, not permitting her to break out in ribald satires or soulless sonnets. She must of no account be offered for sale, unless indeed it be in heroic poems, moving tragedies, or sprightly and ingenious comedies. She must not be touched by the buffoons, nor by the ignorant vulgar incapable of comprehending or appreciating her hidden treasures. And do not suppose, señor, that I apply the term vulgar here merely to plebeians and the lower orders, for everyone who is ignorant, be he lord or prince, may and should be included among the vulgar. He, then, who shall embrace and cultivate poetry under the conditions I have named, shall become famous, and his name honored throughout all the civilized nations of the earth. And with regard to what you say, señor, of your son having no great opinion of Spanish poetry, I am inclined to think that he is not quite right there, and for this reason. The great poet Homer did not write in Latin, because he was a Greek, nor did Virgil write in Greek, because he was a Latin. In short, all the ancient poets wrote in the language they imbibed with their mother's milk, and never went in quest of foreign ones to express their sublime conceptions. And that being so, the usage should in justice extend to all nations, and the German poet should not be undervalued because he writes in his own language, nor the Castilian, nor even the Biscayan, for writing in his. But your son, señor, I suspect, is not prejudiced against Spanish poetry, but against those poets who are mere Spanish verse-writers, without any knowledge of other languages or sciences to adorn and to give life and vigor to their natural inspiration. And yet, even in this he may be wrong. For according to a true belief, a poet is born one. That is to say, the poet by nature comes forth a poet from his mother's womb, and following the bent that heaven has bestowed upon him without the aid of study or art, he produces things that show how truly he spoke who said, est Deus in nobis, etc. At the same time, I say that the poet by nature who calls in art to his aid will be a far better poet, and will surpass him who tries to be one relying upon his knowledge of art alone. The reason is that art does not surpass nature, but only brings it to perfection, and thus nature combined with art, and art with nature, will produce a perfect poet. To bring my argument to a close, I would say then, gentle sir, let your son go on as his star leads him, for being so studious as he seems to be, and having already successfully surmounted the first step of the sciences, which is that of languages, with their help he will by his own exertions reach the summit of polite literature, which so well becomes an independent gentleman, and adorns honours and distinguishes him as much as the mitre does the bishop, or the gown the learned counsellor. If your son writes satires reflecting on the honour of others, chide and correct him, and tear them up. But if he compose discourses in which he rebukes vice in general, in the style of Horace, and with elegance like his, commend him. For it is legitimate for a poet to write against envy, and lash the envious in his verse, and the other vices too, provided he does not single out individuals. There are, however, poets who, for the sake of saying something spiteful, would run the risk of being banished to the coast of Pontus. If the poet be pure in his morals, he will be pure in his verses too. The pen is the tongue of the mind, and as the thought engendered there, so will be the things that it writes down. And when kings and princes observe this marvellous science of poetry in wise, virtuous, and thoughtful subjects, they honour, value, exalt them, and even crown them with the leaves of that tree which the thunderbolt strikes not, as if to show that they whose brows are honoured and adorned with such a crown are not to be assailed by any one. He of the Green Gaban was filled with astonishment at Don Quixote's argument, so much so that he began to abandon the notion he had taken up about his being crazy. But in the middle of the discourse, it not being very much to his taste, Sancho had turned aside out of the road to beg a little milk from some shepherds, who were milking their ewes hard by, and just as the gentleman, highly pleased, was about to renew the conversation, Don Quixote, raising his head, perceived a cart covered with royal flags coming along the road they were travelling, and persuaded that this must be some new adventure, he called aloud to Sancho to come and bring him his helmet. Sancho, hearing himself called, quitted the shepherds, and, prodding Dapple vigorously, came up to his master, to whom there fell a terrific and desperate adventure. End of chapter 16. Recorded by Craig Allen.
Chapter 17 and 18 of Don Quixote, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Leader. Don Quixote, Volume 2, by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Translated by John Ormsby. Chapter 17, wherein is shown the furthest and highest point which the unexampled courage of Don Quixote reached or could reach, together with the happily achieved adventure of the lions. The history tells that when Don Quixote called out to Sancho to bring him his helmet, Sancho was buying some curds the shepherds agreed to sell him, and flurried by the great haste his master was in, did not know what to do with them or what to carry them in. So, not to lose them, for he had already paid for them, he thought it best to throw them into his master's helmet, and, acting on this bright idea, he went to see what his master wanted with him. He, as he approached, exclaimed to him, "Give me that helmet, my friend, for either I know little of adventures, or what I observe yonder is one that will, and does, call upon me to arm myself." He of the Green Gaban, on hearing this, looked in all directions, but could perceive nothing except a cart coming towards them with 2 or 3 small flags, which led him to conclude it must be carrying treasure of the king's, and he said so to Don Quixote. He, however, would not believe him, being always persuaded and convinced that all that happened to him must be adventures and still more adventures. So he replied to the gentleman,
He who is prepared has his battle half fought. Nothing is lost by my preparing myself, for I know by experience that I have enemies, visible and invisible, and I know not when, or where, or at what moment, or in what shapes they will attack me."
And turning to Sancho, he called for his helmet, and Sancho, as he had no time to take out the curds, had to give it just as it was. Don Quixote took it, and without perceiving what was in it, thrust it down in hot haste upon his head. But as the curds were pressed and squeezed, the whey began to run all over his face and beard, whereat he was so startled that he cried out to Sancho,
"Sancho, what's this? I think my head is softening, or my brains are melting, or I'm sweating from head to foot. If I am sweating, it is not indeed from fear. I am convinced beyond a doubt that the adventure which is about to befall me is a terrible one. Give me something to wipe myself with, if thou hast it, for this profuse sweat is blinding me."
Sancho held his tongue, and gave him a cloth, and gave thanks to God at the same time that his master had not found out what was the matter. Don Quixote then wiped himself, and took off his helmet to see what it was that made his head feel so cool, and seeing all that white mash inside his helmet, he put it to his nose, and as soon as he had smelt it, he exclaimed,
"By the life of my lady Dulcinea del Toboso, but it is curds thou hast put there, thou treacherous, impudent, ill-mannered squire!"
To which, with great composure and pretended innocence, Sancho replied, "If they are curds, let me have them, your worship, and I'll eat them. But let the devil eat them, for it must have been he who put them there. I dare to dirty your helmet? You have guessed the offender finely. Faith, sir, by the light God gives me, it seems I must have enchanters too, that persecute me as a creature and limb of your worship, and they must have put that nastiness there in order to provoke your patience to anger, and make you baste my ribs as you are wont to do. Well, this time indeed they have missed their aim, for I trust to my master's good sense to see that I have got no curds or milk or anything of the sort, and that if I had, it is in my stomach I would put it, and not in the helmet."
"Maybe so," said Don Quixote.
All this the gentleman was observing, and with astonishment, more especially when, after having wiped himself clean, his head, face, beard, and helmet, Don Quixote put it on, and, settling himself firmly in his stirrups, easing his sword in the scabbard, and grasping his lance, he cried, "Now come who will, here am I, ready to try conclusions with Satan himself in person." By this time the cart with the flags had come up, unattended by anyone except the carter on a mule, and a man sitting in front. Don Quixote planted himself before it, and said, "Whither are you going, brothers? What cart is this? What have you got in it? What flags are those?" To this the carter replied, "The cart is mine. What is in it is a pair of wild caged lions, which the governor of Oran is sending to court as a present to his majesty, and the flags are our lord the king's, to show that what is here is his property."
"And are the lions large?" asked Don Quixote.
"So large," replied the man who sat at the door of the cart, "that larger, or as large, have never crossed from Africa to Spain. I am the keeper, and I have brought over others, but never any like these. They are male and female. The male is in that first cage, and the female in the one behind. And they are hungry now, for they have eaten nothing today, so let your worship stand aside, for we must make haste to the place where we are to feed them." Hereupon, smiling slightly, Don Quixote exclaimed,
"Lion whelps! To me whelps of lions, and at such a time! Then, by God, those gentlemen who send them here shall see if I am a man to be frightened by lions. Get down, my good fellow, and as you are the keeper, open the cages, and turn me out those beasts, and in the midst of this plain I will let them know who Don Quixote of La Mancha is, in spite and in the teeth of the enchanters who send them to me."
"So, said the gentleman to himself at this, "our worthy knight has shown of what sort he is. The curds, no doubt, have softened his skull and brought his brains to a head." At this instant Sancho came up to him, saying,
"Señor, for God's sake, do something to keep my master Don Quixote from tackling these lions, for if he does, they'll tear us all to pieces here."
"Is your master so mad," asked the gentleman, "that you believe and are afraid he will engage such fierce animals?"
"He is not mad," said Sancho, "but he is venturesome."
"I will prevent it," said the gentleman, and going over to Don Quixote, who was insisting upon the keeper's opening the cages, he said to him, "Sir Knight, knights errant should attempt adventures which encourage the hope of a successful issue, not those which entirely withhold it. For valor that trenches upon temerity savours rather of madness than of courage. Moreover, these lions do not come to oppose you, nor do they dream of such a thing. They are going as presents to his Majesty, and it will not be right to stop them or delay their journey."
"Gentle sir," replied Don Quixote, "you go and mind your tame partridge and your bold ferret, and leave everyone to manage his own business. This is mine, and I know whether these gentlemen the lions come to me or not."
And then, turning to the keeper, he exclaimed,
"By all that's good, sir scoundrel, if you don't open the cages this very instant, I'll pin you to the cart with this lance."
The carter, seeing the determination of this apparition in armour, said to him, "Please your worship, for charity's sake, señor, let me unyoke the mules and place myself in safety along with them before the lions are turned out, for if they kill them on me, I am ruined for life, for all I possess is this cart and mules."
"O man of little faith," replied Don Quixote, "get down and unyoke. You will soon see that you are exerting yourself for nothing, and that you might have spared yourself the trouble."
The carter got down, and with all speed unyoked the mules, and the keeper called out at the top of his voice, "I call all here to witness that against my will and under compulsion I opened the cages and let the lions loose, and that I warn this gentleman that he will be accountable for all the harm and mischief which these beasts may do, and for my salary and dues as well. You, gentlemen, place yourselves in safety before I open, for I know they will do me no harm." Once more the gentleman strove to persuade Don Quixote not to do such a mad thing, as it was tempting God to engage in such a piece of folly. To this Don Quixote replied that he knew what he was about. The gentleman in return entreated him to reflect, for he knew he was under a delusion.
"Well, señor," answered Don Quixote, "if you do not like to be a spectator of this tragedy, as in your opinion it will be, spur your flea-bitten mare, and place yourself in safety."
Hearing this, Sancho, with tears in his eyes, entreated him to give up an enterprise compared with which the one of the windmills, and the awful one of the fulling mills, and in fact all the feats he had attempted in the whole course of his life, were cakes and fancy bread.
"Look ye, señor," said Sancho, "there's no enchantment here, nor anything of the sort. For between the bars and chinks of the cage I have seen the paw of a real lion, and judging by that, I reckon the lion such a paw could belong to must be bigger than a mountain."
"Fear, at any rate," replied Don Quixote, "will make him look bigger to thee than half the world."
"Retire, Sancho, and leave me, and if I die here, thou knowest our old compact, thou wilt repair to Dulcinea. I say no more."
To these he added some further words that banished all hope of his giving up his insane project. He of the green gaban would have offered resistance, but He found himself ill-matched as to arms, and did not think it prudent to come to blows with a madman, for such Don Quixote now showed himself to be in every respect. And the latter, renewing his commands to the keeper and repeating his threats, gave warning to the gentleman to spur his mare, Sancho his dapple, and the carter his mules, all striving to get away from the cart as far as they could before the lions broke loose. Sancho was weeping over his master's death, for this time he firmly believed it was in store for him from the claws of the lions, and he cursed his fate, and called it an unlucky hour when he thought of taking service with him again. But with all his tears and lamentations, he did not forget to thrash Dapple so as to put a good space between himself and the cart. The keeper, seeing that the fugitives were now some distance off, once more entreated and warned him as before, but he replied that he heard him, and that he need not trouble himself with any further warnings or entreaties, as they would be fruitless, and bade him make haste. During the delay that occurred while the keeper was opening the first cage, Don Quixote was considering whether it would not be well to do battle on foot, instead of on horseback, and finally resolved to fight on foot, fearing that Rocinante might take fright at the sight of the lions. He therefore sprang off his horse, flung his lance aside, braced his buckler on his arm, and drawing his sword, advanced slowly with marvellous intrepidity and resolute courage to plant himself in front of the cart, commending himself with all his heart to God and to his lady Dulcinea. It is to be observed that on coming to this passage, the author of this veracious history breaks out into exclamations.
O doughty Don Quixote, high-mettled past extolling, mirror wherein all the heroes of the world may see themselves, second modern Don Manuel de Leon, once the glory and honor of Spanish knighthood. In what words shall I describe this dread exploit? By what language shall I make it credible to ages to come? What eulogies are there unmeet for thee, though they be hyperboles piled upon hyperboles? On foot, alone, undaunted, high-souled, with but a simple sword, and that no trenchant blade of the Parillo brand, a shield, but no bright polished steel one, there stoodst thou biding and awaiting the two fiercest lions that Africa's forests ever bred. Thy own deeds be thy praise, valiant Manchegan, and here I leave them as they stand, wanting the words wherewith to glorify them.
Here the author's outburst came to an end, and he proceeded to take up the thread of his story, saying that the keeper, seeing that Don Quixote had taken up his position, and that it was impossible for him to avoid letting out the mail without incurring the enmity of the fiery and daring knight, flung open the doors of the first cage, containing, as has been said, the lion, which was now seen to be of enormous size and grim and hideous mien. The first thing he did was to turn round in the cage in which he lay, and protrude his claws, and stretch himself thoroughly. He next opened his mouth, and yawned very leisurely, and with near 2 palms' length of tongue that he had thrust forth, he licked the dust out of his eyes and washed his face. Having done this, he put his head out of the cage and looked all round with eyes like glowing coals, a spectacle and demeanor to strike terror into temerity itself. Don Quixote merely observed him steadily, longing for him to leap from the cart and come to close quarters with him, when he hoped to hew him in pieces. So far did his unparalleled madness go, but the noble lion, more courteous than arrogant, not troubling himself about silly bravado, after having looked around, as has been said, turned about and presented his hindquarters to Don Quixote, and very coolly and tranquilly lay down again in the cage. Seeing this, Don Quixote ordered the keeper to take a stick to him and provoke him to make him come out.
"That I won't," said the keeper, "for if I anger him, the first he'll tear in pieces will be myself. Be satisfied, Sir Knight, with what you have done, which leaves nothing more to be said on the score of courage, and do not seek to tempt fortune a second time. The lion has the door open. He is free to come out or not to come out, but as he has not come out so far, he will not come out today. Your worship's great courage has been fully manifested already. No brave champion, so it strikes me, is bound to do more than challenge his enemy and wait for him on the field. If his adversary does not come, on him lies the disgrace, and he who waits for him carries off the crown of victory." "That is true," said Don Quixote. "Close the door, my friend, and let me have, in the best form thou canst, what thou hast seen me do, by way of certificate, to wit, that thou didst open for the lion, that I waited for him, that he did not come out, that I still waited for him, and that still he did not come out, and lay down again. I am not bound to do more. Enchantments avaunt, and God uphold the right, the truth, and true chivalry. Close the door as I bade thee, while I make signals to the fugitives that have left us, that they may learn this exploit from thy lips."
The keeper obeyed, and Don Quixote, fixing on the point of his lance the cloth he had wiped his face with after the deluge of curds, proceeded to recall the others, who still continued to fly, looking back at every step, all in a body, the gentleman bringing up the rear. Sancho, however, happening to observe the signal of the white cloth, exclaimed,
"May I die if my master has not overcome the wild beasts, for he is calling to us."
They all stopped, and perceived that it was Don Quixote who was making signals, and shaking off their fears to some extent, they approached slowly until they were near enough to hear distinctly Don Quixote's voice calling to them. They returned at length to the cart, and as they came up, Don Quixote said to the carter,
"Put your mules to once more, brother, and continue your journey, and do thou, Sancho, give him 2 gold crowns for himself and the keeper, to compensate for the delay they have incurred through me."
"That will I give with all my heart," said Sancho. "But what has become of the lions? Are they dead or alive?"
The keeper then, in full detail and bit by bit, described the end of the contest, exalting to the best of his power and ability the valor of Don Quixote, at the sight of whom the lion quailed, and would not and dared not come out of the cage, although he had held the door open ever so long, and showing how, in consequence of his having represented to the knight that it was tempting God to provoke the lion in order to force him out, which he wished to have done, he very reluctantly, and altogether against his will, had allowed the door to be closed.
"What dost thou think of this, Sancho?" said Don Quixote. "Are there any enchantments that can prevail against true valor? The enchanters may be able to rob me of good fortune, but of fortitude and courage they cannot."
Sancho paid the crowns, the carter put 2, the keeper kissed Don Quixote's hands for the bounty bestowed upon him, and promised to give an account of the valiant exploit to the king himself as soon as he saw him at court.
"Then," said Don Quixote, "if his majesty should happen to ask who performed it, you must say, 'The Knight of the Lions,' for it is my desire that into this the name I have hitherto borne of Knight of the Rueful Countenance be from this time forward changed, altered, transformed, and turned, and in this I follow the ancient usage of knights errant, who changed their names when they pleased or when it suited their purpose."
The cart went its way, and Don Quixote, Sancho, and he of the green gaban went theirs. All this time Don Diego de Miranda had not spoken a word, being entirely taken up with observing and noting all that Don Quixote did and said, and the opinion he formed was that he was a man of brains gone mad, and a madman on the verge of rationality. The first part of his history had not yet reached him, for, had he read it, the amazement with which his words and deeds filled him would have vanished, as he would then have understood the nature of his madness. But knowing nothing of it, He took him to be rational one moment and crazy the next, for what he said was sensible, elegant, and well expressed, and what he did absurd, rash, and foolish. And he said to himself, "What could be madder than putting on a helmet full of curds, and then persuading oneself that enchanters are softening one's skull? Or what could be greater rashness and folly than wanting to fight lions tooth and nail?" Don Quixote roused him from these reflections and this soliloquy by saying, "No doubt, Señor Don Diego de Miranda, you set me down in your mind as a fool and a madman, and it would be no wonder if you did, for my deeds do not argue anything else. But, for all that, I would have you take notice that I am neither so mad nor so foolish as I must have seemed to you. A gallant knight shows to advantage bringing his lance to bear adroitly upon a fierce bull under the eyes of his sovereign, in the midst of a spacious plaza. A knight shows to advantage arrayed in glittering armour, pacing the lists before the ladies in some joyous tournament, and all those knights show to advantage that entertain, divert, and, if we may say so, honour the courts of their princes by warlike exercises, or what resemble them. But to greater advantage than all these does a knight-errant show when he traverses deserts, solitudes, crossroads, forests, and mountains, in quest of perilous adventures, bent on bringing them to a happy and successful issue, all to win a glorious and lasting renown. To greater advantage, I maintain, does the knight-errant show bringing aid to some widow in some lonely waste, than the court knight dallying with some city damsel. All knights have their own special parts to play. Let the courtier devote himself to the ladies, let him add lustre to his sovereign's court by his liveries, let him entertain poor gentlemen with the sumptuous fare of his table, let him arrange joustings, martial tournaments, and prove himself noble, generous, and magnificent, and above all a good Christian, and so doing he will fulfil the duties that are especially his. But let the knight-errant explore the corners of the earth, and penetrate the most intricate labyrinths. At each step let him attempt impossibilities. On desolate heaths let him endure the burning rays of the midsummer sun, and the bitter inclemency of the winter winds and frosts. Let no lions daunt him, nor monsters terrify him, no dragons make him quail. For to seek these, to attack those, and to vanquish all are in truth his main duties. I, then, as it has fallen to my lot to be a member of knight-errantry, cannot avoid attempting all that to me seems to come within the sphere of my duties. Thus it was my bounden duty to attack those lions that I just now attacked, although I knew it to be the height of rashness. For I know well what valour is, that it is a virtue that occupies a place between two vicious extremes, cowardice and temerity. But it will be a lesser evil for him who is valiant to rise till he reaches the point of rashness, than to sink until he reaches the point of cowardice. For as it is easier for the prodigal than for the miser to become generous, so it is easier for a rash man to prove truly valiant than for a coward to rise to true valour. And believe me, Señor Don Diego, in attempting adventures it is better to lose by a card too many than by a card too few, for to hear it said, "Such a knight is rash and daring," sounds better than "Such a knight is timid and cowardly." "I protest, Señor Don Quixote," said Don Diego, "everything you have said and done is proved correct by the test of reason itself, and I believe, if the laws and ordinances of knight-errantry should be lost, they might be found in your worship's breast, as in their own proper depository and muniment house. But let us make haste, and reach my village, where you shall take rest after your late exertions, for if they have not been of the body, they have been of the spirit, and these sometimes tend to produce bodily fatigue." "I take the invitation as a great favour and honour, Señor Don Diego. replied Don Quixote, and pressing forward at a better pace than before, at about 2 in the afternoon they reached the village and house of Don Diego, or as Don Quixote called him, the Knight of the Green Gaban. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. Of what happened to Don Quixote in the castle or house of the Knight of the Green Gaban, together with other matters out of the common. Don Quixote found Don Diego de Miranda's house built in village style, with his arms in rough stone over the street door. In the patio was the storeroom, and at the entrance the cellar, with plenty of wine jars standing round, which, coming from El Toboso, brought back to his memory his enchanted and transformed Dulcinea. And with a sigh, and not thinking of what he was saying or in whose presence he was, he exclaimed, "O ye sweet treasures to my sorrow found, once sweet and welcome when 'twas heaven's good will! O ye Tobosan jars, how ye bring back to my memory the sweet object of my bitter regrets!" The student poet, Don Diego's son, who had come out with his mother to receive him, heard this exclamation, and both mother and son were filled with amazement at the extraordinary figure he presented. He, however, dismounting from Rocinante, advanced with great politeness to ask permission to kiss the lady's hand, while Don Diego said, "Señora, pray receive with your wonted kindness Señor Don Quixote of La Mancha, whom you see before you, a knight-errant, and the bravest and wisest in the world." The lady, whose name was Donna Cristina, received him with every sign of goodwill and great courtesy, and Don Quixote placed himself at her service with an abundance of well-chosen and polished phrases. Almost the same civilities were exchanged between him and the student, who, listening to Don Quixote, took him to be a sensible, clear-headed person. Here the author describes minutely everything belonging to Don Diego's mansion, putting before us in his picture the whole contents of a rich gentleman farmer's house. But the translator of the history thought it best to pass over these and other details of the same sort in silence, as they are not in harmony with the main purpose of the story, the strong point of which is truth rather than dull digressions. They led Don Quixote into a room, and Sancho removed his armour, leaving him in loose walloon breeches and chamois leather doublet, all stained with the rust of his armour. His collar was a falling one of scholastic cut, without starch or lace, his buskins buff-coloured, and his shoes polished. He wore his good sword, which hung in a baldric of sea-wolf skin, for he had suffered for many years, they say, from an ailment of the kidneys, and over all he threw a long cloak of good grey cloth. But first of all, with 5 or 6 buckets of water, for as regard the number of buckets there is some dispute, he washed his head and face, and still the water remained whey-coloured, thanks to Sancho's greediness and purchase of those unlucky curds that turned his master so white. Thus arrayed, and with an easy, sprightly, and gallant air, Don Quixote passed out into another room, where the student was waiting to entertain him while the table was being laid, for on the arrival of so distinguished a guest, Donna Cristina was anxious to show that she knew how and was able to give a becoming reception to those who came to her house. While Don Quixote was taking off his armour, Don Lorenzo, for so Don Diego's son was called, took the opportunity to say to his father, "What are we to make of this gentleman you have brought home to us, sir? For his name, his appearance, and your describing him as a knight-errant have completely puzzled my mother and me." "I don't know what to say, my son," replied Don Diego. "All I can tell thee is that I have seen him act the acts of the greatest madman in the world, and heard him make observations so sensible that they efface and undo all he does. Do thou talk to him, and feel the pulse of his wits, and, as thou art shrewd, form the most reasonable conclusion thou canst as to his wisdom or folly, though, to tell the truth,
I am more inclined to take him to be mad than sane." With this, Don Lorenzo went away to entertain Don Quixote, as has been said, and in the course of the conversation that passed between them, Don Quixote said to Don Lorenzo, "Your father, Señor Don Diego de Miranda, has told me of the rare abilities and subtle intellect you possess, and, above all, that you are a great poet."
"A poet it may be," replied Don Lorenzo, "but a great one by no means. It is true that I am somewhat given to poetry, and to reading good poets, but not so much so as to justify the title of great which my father gives me."
"I do not dislike that modesty," said Don Quixote, "for there is no poet who is not conceited and does not think he is the best poet in the world."
"There is no rule without an exception," said Don Lorenzo. "There may be some who are poets, and yet do not think they are."
"Very few," said Don Quixote. "But tell me, what verses are those which you have now in hand, and which your father tells me keep you somewhat restless and absorbed? If it be some gloss, I know something about glosses, and I should like to hear them; and if they are for a poetical tournament, contrive to carry off the second prize, for the first always goes by favour or personal standing, the second by simple justice, and so the third comes to be the second, and the first, reckoning in this way, will be third, in the same way as licentiate degrees are conferred at the universities. But, for all that, the title of first is a great distinction."
"So far," said Don Lorenzo to himself, "I should not take you to be a madman, but let us go on." So he said to him, "Your worship has apparently attended the schools. What sciences have you studied?"
"That of knight-errantry," said Don Quixote, "which is as good as that of poetry, and even a finger or two above it."
"I do not know what science that is," said Don Lorenzo, "and until now I have never heard of it."
"It is a science," said Don Quixote, "that comprehends in itself all or most of the sciences in the world, for he who professes it must be a jurist, and must know the rules of justice, distributive and equitable, so as to give to each one what belongs to him and is due to him. He must be a theologian, so as to be able to give a clear and distinctive reason for the Christian faith he professes, wherever it may be asked of him. He must be a physician, and above all a herbalist, so as in wastes and solitudes to know the herbs that have the property of healing wounds, for a knight-errant must not go looking for someone to cure him at every step. He must be an astronomer, so as to know by the stars how many hours of the night have passed, and what clime and quarter of the world he is in. He must know mathematics, for at every turn some occasion for them will present itself to him, and putting it aside that he must be adorned with all the virtues, cardinal and theological, to come down to minor particulars, he must, I say, be able to swim as well as Nicholas or Nicolao the fish could, as the story goes. He must know how to shoe a horse, and repair his saddle and bridle, and, to return to higher matters, he must be faithful to God and to his lady. He must be pure in thought, decorous in words, generous in works, valiant in deeds, patient in suffering, compassionate towards the needy, and lastly, an upholder of the truth, though its defence should cost him his life. Of all these qualities, great and small, is a true knight-errant made up. Judge, then, Señor Don Lorenzo, whether it be a contemptible science which the knight who studies and professes it has to learn, and whether it may not compare with the very loftiest that are taught in the schools."
"If that be so," replied Don Lorenzo, "this science, I protest, surpasses all."
"How, if that be so?" said Don Quixote.
"What I mean to say," said Don Lorenzo, "is that I doubt whether there are now, or ever were, any knights errant, and adorned with such virtues."
"Many a time," replied Don Quixote, "have I said what I now say once more, that the majority of the world are of opinion that there never were any knights errant in it, and as it is my opinion that unless heaven by some miracle brings home to them the truth that there were and are, all the pains one takes will be in vain, as experience has often proved to me. I will not now stop to disabuse you of the error you share with the multitude. All I shall do is to pray to heaven to deliver you from it, and to show you how beneficial and necessary knights errant were in days of yore,
and how useful they would be in these days were they but in vogue.
But now, for the sins of the people, sloth and indolence, gluttony and luxury are triumphant.
"Our guest has broken out on our hands," said Don Lorenzo to himself at this point, "but for all that, he is a glorious madman, and I should be a dull blockhead to doubt it." Here, being summoned to dinner, they brought their colloquy to a close. Don Diego asked his son what he had been able to make out as to the wits of their guest, to which he replied, "All the doctors and clever scribes in the world will not make sense of the scrawl of his madness. He is a madman full of streaks, full of lucid intervals." They went in to dinner, and the repast was such as Don Diego said on the road he was in the habit of giving to his guests, neat, plentiful, and tasty. But what pleased Don Quixote most was the marvellous silence that reigned throughout the house, for it was like a Carthusian monastery. When the cloth had been removed, grace said, and their hands washed, Don Quixote earnestly pressed Don Lorenzo to repeat to him his verses for the poetical tournament, to which he replied, "Not to be like those poets who, when they are asked to recite their verses, refuse, and when they are not asked for them, vomit them up. I will repeat my gloss, for which I do not expect any prize, having composed it merely as an exercise of ingenuity."
A discerning friend of mine, said Don Quixote, was of opinion that no one ought to waste labour in glossing verses, and the reason he gave was that the gloss can never come up to the text, and that often or most frequently it wanders away from the meaning and purpose aimed at the glossed lines, and besides, that the laws of the gloss were too strict, as they did not allow interrogations, nor said he, nor I say, nor turning verbs into nouns, or altering the construction, not to speak of other restrictions and limitations that fetter gloss writers, as you no doubt know.
"Verily, Señor Don Quixote," said Don Lorenzo, "I wish I could catch your worship tripping at a stretch, but I cannot, for you slip through my fingers like an eel."
"I don't understand what you say or mean by slipping," said Don Quixote.
"I will explain myself another time," said Don Lorenzo. "For the present pray attend to the glossed verses and the gloss, which run thus: Could was become an is for me, then would I ask no more than this, or could, for me, the time that is become the time that is to be. Gloss. Dame Fortune once upon a day to me was bountiful and kind, but all things change. She changed her mind, and what she gave she took away. O Fortune, long I've sued to thee, the gifts thou gavest me restore, for, trust me, I would ask no more, could was become an is for me. No other prize I seek to gain, no triumph, glory, or success, only the long-lost happiness, the memory whereof is pain. One taste, methinks, of bygone bliss the heart-consuming fire might stay, and, so it come without delay, then would I ask no more than this. I asked what cannot be, alas! that time should ever be and then come back to us and be again. No power on earth can bring to pass. For fleet of foot is he, I wis, and idly, therefore, do we pray that, for aye hath left us may become for us the time that is. Perplexed, uncertain to remain, twixt hope and fear is death, not life. 'Twere better, sure, to end the strife, and dying seek release from pain. And yet thought were the best for me. Anon the thought aside I fling, and to the present fondly cling, and dread the time that is to be.
When Don Lorenzo had finished reciting his gloss, Don Quixote stood up, and in a loud voice, almost a shout, exclaimed as he grasped Don Lorenzo's right hand in his, "By the highest heavens, noble youth, but you are the best poet on earth, and deserve to be crowned with laurel, not by Cyprus or by Gaeta, as a certain poet, God forgive him, said, but by the academies of Athens, if they still flourished, and by those that flourish now, Paris, Bologna, Salamanca. Heaven grant that the judges who rob you of the first prize, that Phoebus may pierce them with his arrows, and the muses never cross the thresholds of their doors. Repeat me some of your long measure verses, señor, if you will be so good, for I want thoroughly to feel the pulse of your rare genius." Is there any need to say that Don Lorenzo enjoyed hearing himself praised by Don Quixote, albeit he looked upon him as a madman? Power of flattery, how far-reaching art thou, and how wide are the bounds of thy pleasant jurisdiction! Don Lorenzo gave a proof of it, for he complied with Don Quixote's request and entreaty, and repeated to him this sonnet on the fable or story of Pyramus and Thisbe.
Sonnet. The lovely maid, she pierces now the wall, heart pierced by her young Pyramus doth lie, and love spreads wing from Cyprus isle to fly, a chink to view so wondrous great and small. There silence speaketh, for no voice at all can pass so strait a strait, but love will ply, where to all other power 'twere vain to try. For love will find a way, whate'er befall. Impatient of delay, with reckless pace the rash maid wins the fatal spot where she sinks not in lover's arms, but death's embrace. So runs the strange tale, how the lovers twain, one sword, one sepulchre, one memory, slays, and entombs, and brings to life again.
"Blessed be God," said Don Quixote when he had heard Don Lorenzo's sonnet, "that among the hosts there are of irritable poets, I have found one consummate one, which, señor, the art of this sonnet proves to me that you are." For 4 days was Don Quixote most sumptuously entertained in Don Diego's house, at the end of which time he asked his permission to depart, telling him he thanked him for the kindness and hospitality he had received in his house, but that, as it did not become knights errant to give themselves up for long to idleness and luxury, he was anxious to fulfil the duties of his calling in seeking adventures, of which he was informed there was an abundance in that neighbourhood, where he hoped to employ his time until the day came round for the jousts at Saragossa, for that was his proper destination, and that, first of all, he meant to enter the cave of Montesinos, of which so many marvellous things were reported all through the country, and at the same time to investigate and explore the origin and true source of the 7 lakes commonly called the Lakes of Ruidera. Don Diego and his son commended his laudable resolution, and bade him furnish himself with all he wanted from their house and belongings, as they would most gladly be of service to him, which indeed his personal worth and his honourable profession made incumbent upon them. The day of his departure came at length, as welcome to Don Quixote as it was sad and sorrowful to Sancho Panza, who was very well satisfied with the abundance of Don Diego's house, and objected to return to the starvation of the woods and wilds and the short commons of his ill-stocked alforjas. These, however, he filled and packed with what he considered needful. On taking leave, Don Quixote said to Don Lorenzo, "I know not whether I have told you already, but if I have,
I tell you once more that if you wish to spare yourself fatigue and toil in reaching the inaccessible summit of the Temple of Fame, you have nothing to do but to turn aside out of the somewhat narrow path of poetry, and take the still narrower one of knight-errantry, wide enough, however, to make you an emperor in the twinkling of an eye."
In this speech Don Quixote wound up the evidence of his madness, but still better in what he added when he said,
"God knows I would gladly take Don Lorenzo with me to teach him how to spare the humble and trample the proud under foot, virtues that are part and parcel of the profession I belong to; but since his tender age does not allow of it, nor his praiseworthy pursuits permit it, I will simply content myself with impressing it upon your worship that you will become famous as a poet if you are guided by the opinion of others rather than by your own, because no fathers or mothers ever think their own children ill-favored, and this sort of deception prevails still more strongly in the case of the children of the brain."
Both father and son were amazed afresh at the strange medley Don Quixote talked, at one moment sense, at another nonsense, and at the pertinacity and persistence he displayed in going through thick and thin in quest of his unlucky adventures, which he made the end and aim of his desires. There was a renewal of offers of service and civilities, and then, with the gracious permission of the lady of the castle, they took their departure, Don Quixote on Rocinante, and Sancho on Dapple. End of chapter 18. Recording by John Leader, Bloomington, Illinois.
Chapters 19 and 20 of Don Quixote Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jamie Strassenberg. Don Quixote Volume 2 by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Translated by John Ormsby. Chapter 19. In which is related the adventure of the enamored shepherd, together with other truly droll incidents. Don Quixote had gone but a short distance beyond Don Diego's village, when he fell in with a couple of either priests or students, and a couple of peasants, mounted on 4 beasts of the ass kind. One of the students carried, wrapped up in a piece of green buckram by way of portmanteau, what seemed to be a little linen and a couple pairs of ribbed stockings. The other carried nothing but a pair of new fencing foils with buttons. The peasants carried divers articles that showed they were on their way from some large town where they had bought them, and were taking them to their home village. And both students and peasants were struck with the same amazement that everyone felt who saw Don Quixote for the first time, and were dying to know who this man, so different from ordinary men, could be. Don Quixote saluted them, and after ascertaining that their road was the same as his, made them an offer of his company, and begged them to slacken their pace, as their young asses travelled faster than his horse. And then, to gratify them, he told them in a few words who he was and the calling and profession he followed, which was that of a knight-errant seeking adventures in all parts of the world. He informed them that his own name was Don Quixote of La Mancha, and that he was called, by way of surname, the Knight of the Lions. All this was Greek or gibberish to the peasants, but not so to the students, who very soon perceived the crack in Don Quixote's pate. For all that, however, they regarded him with admiration and respect, and one of them said to him, "If you, Sir Knight, have no fixed road, as it is the way with those who seek adventures not to have any, let your worship come with us. You will see one of the finest and richest weddings that up to this day have ever been celebrated in La Mancha, or for many a league round." Don Quixote asked him if it was some prince's that he spoke of it in this way. "Not at all," said the student. "It is a wedding of a farmer and a farmer's daughter. He is the richest in all this country, she the fairest mortal ever set eyes on. The display with which it is to be attended will be something rare and out of the common, for it will be celebrated in a meadow adjoining to the town of the bride, who is called, par excellence, Quiteria the Fair, as the bridegroom is called Camacho the Rich. She is 18 and he 22, and they are fairly matched. though some knowing ones, who have all the pedigrees in the world by heart, will have it that the family of the fair Quiteria is better than Camacho's. But no one minds that nowadays, for wealth can solder a great many flaws. At any rate, Camacho is free-handed, and it is his fancy to screen the whole meadow with boughs and cover it in overhead, so that the son will have hard work if he tries to get in to reach the grass that covers the soil. He has provided dancers too, not only sword but also bell dancers, for in his own town there are those who ring the changes and jingle the bells to perfection. Of shoe dancers I say nothing, for of them he has engaged a host. But none of these things, nor of the many others I have omitted to mention, will do more to make this a memorable wedding than the part which I suggest the despairing Basilio will play in it. This Basilio is a youth of the same village as Quiteria, and he lived in the house next door to that of her parents, of which circumstance love took advantage to reproduce the word of the long-forgotten loves of Pyramus and Thisbe, for Basilio loved Quiteria from his earliest years, and she responded to his passion with countless modest proofs of affection, so that the loves of the two children, Basilio and Quiteria, were the talk and amusement of the town. As they grew up, the father of Quiteria made up his mind to refuse Basilio his wonted freedom of access to the house, and to relieve himself of constant doubts and suspicions, he arranged a match for his daughter with the rich Camacho, as he did not approve of marrying her to Basilio, who had not so large a share of the gifts of fortune as of nature, for if the truth be told ungrudgingly, he is the most agile youth we know, a mighty thrower of the bar, a first-rate wrestler, and a great ball-player. He runs like a deer, and leaps better than a goat, bowls over the 9 pins as if by magic, sings like a lark, plays the guitar as though to make it speak, and above all, handles a sword as well as the best. For that excellence alone, said Don Quixote at this, the youth deserves to marry, not merely the fair Quiteria, but Queen Guinevere herself, were she alive now, in spite of Lancelot and all who would try to prevent it. Say that to my wife, said Sancho, who had until now listened in silence, for she won't hear of anything but each one marrying his equal, holding with the proverb, each ewe to her like. And what I would like is that this good Basilio, for I am beginning to take a fancy to him already, should marry this lady Quiteria, and a blessing and good luck, I mean to say the opposite, on people who would prevent those who love one another from marrying. If all those who love one another were to marry, said Don Quixote, it would deprive parents of the right to choose, and marry their children to the proper person and at the proper time, and if it was left to daughters to choose husbands as they pleased, one would be for choosing her father's servant, and another, someone she has seen passing in the street and fancies gallant and dashing, though he may be a drunken bully, for love and fancy easily blind the eyes of judgment, so wanted in choosing one's way of life, and the matrimonial choice is very liable to error, and it needs great caution and the special favour of heaven to make it a good one. He who has had a long journey will, if he is wise, look for some trusty and pleasant companion to accompany him before he sets out. Why then, should not he do the same, who has to make the whole journey of life down to the final halting place of death, more especially when the companion has to be his companion in bed, at board, and everywhere, as the wife is to her husband? The companionship of one's wife is no article of merchandise, that, after it has been bought, may be returned, or bartered, or changed, for it is an inseparable accident that lasts as long as life lasts. It is a noose that, once you put it round your neck, it turns into a Gordian knot, which, if the scythe of death does not cut it, there is no untying. I could say a great deal more on this subject, were I not prevented by the anxiety I feel to know if the Señor Licentiate has anything more to tell about the story of Basilio. To this the student, bachelor, or, as Don Quixote called him, licentiate, replied, I have nothing whatever to say further, but that from the moment Basilio learned that the fair Quiteria was to be married to Camacho the rich, he has never been seen to smile, or heard to utter a rational word, and he always goes about moody and dejected, talking to himself in a way that shows plainly he is out of his senses. He eats little and sleeps little, and all he eats is fruit, and when he sleeps, if he sleeps at all, it is in the field on the hard earth like a brute beast. Sometimes he gazes at the sky, and other times he fixes his eyes on the earth in such an abstracted way that he might be taken for a clothed statue, with its drapery stirred by the wind. In short, he shows such signs of a heart crushed by suffering, that all we who know him believe that when tomorrow the fair Quiteria says yes, it will be his sentence of death. God will guide it better, said Sancho, for God who gives the wound gives the salve. Nobody knows what will happen. There are a good many hours between this and tomorrow, and any one of them, or any moment, the house may fall. I have seen the rain coming down and the sun shining all at one time. Many a one goes to bed in good health who can't stir the next day. And tell me, is there any one who can boast of having driven a nail into the wheel of fortune? No, faith. And between a woman's yes and no I wouldn't venture to put the point of a pin, for there would be not room for it. If you tell me Quiteria loves Basilio heart and soul, then I'll give him a bag of good luck. For love, I have heard say, looks through spectacles that make copper seem gold, poverty wealth, and blear eyes pearls. What art thou driving at, Sancho? Curses on thee, said Don Quixote, for when thou takest to stringing proverbs and sayings together, no one can understand thee but Judas himself, and I wish he had thee. Tell me, thou animal, what dost thou know about nails or wheels or anything else? Oh, if you don't understand me, replied Sancho, it is no wonder my words are taken for nonsense. But no matter. I understand myself, and I know I have not said anything very foolish in what I have said. Only your worship, señor, is always grovelling at everything I say, nay, everything I do. Caviling, not gravelling, said Sancho, thou prevaricator of honest language, God confound thee. Don't find fault with me, your worship, returned Sancho, for you know I have not been bred up at court or trained at Salamanca, to know whether I am adding or dropping a letter or so in my words. Why, God bless me, it's not fair to force a Sayago man to speak like a Toledan. Maybe there are Toledans who do not hit it off when it comes to polished talk. That is true, said the licentiate, for those who have been bred up in the tanneries and the zocodover cannot talk like those who are almost all day pacing in the cathedral cloisters, and yet they are all Toledans. Pure, correct, elegant, and lucid language will be met with men of courtly breeding and discrimination, though they may have been born in Majalahonda. I say of discrimination, because there are many who are not so, and discrimination is the grammar of good language, if it be accompanied by practice. I, sirs, for my sins have studied canon law at Salamanca, and I rather pick myself on expressing my mean in clear, plain, and intelligible language. If you did not pick yourself more on your dexterity with those foils you carry than on dexterity of tongue, said the other student, you would have been head of the degrees, where you are now tail. Look here, bachelor Corchuelo, returned the licentiate, you have the most mistaken idea in the world about skill with the sword, if you think it useless. It is no idea on my part, but an established truth, replied Corchuelo. And if you wish me to prove it to you by experiment, you have swords there, and it is a good opportunity. I have had a steady hand and a strong arm, and these joined with my resolution, which is not small, will make you confess that I am not mistaken. Dismount and put it in practice your positions and circles and angles in science, for I hope to make you see stars at noonday with my rude, raw swordsmanship, in which, next to God, place my trust that the man is yet to be born who will make me turn my back, and that there is not one in the world I will not compel to give ground. As to whether you turn your back or not, I do not concern myself, replied the master of fence, though it might be that your grave would be dug on the spot where you placed your foot the first time. I mean that you would be stretched dead there for despising skill with the sword. We shall soon see, replied Corchuelo, and getting off his ass briskly, he drew out furiously one of the swords the licentiate carried on his beast. It must not be that way, said Don Quixote at this point. I will be the director of this fencing match, and judge of this often disputed question. And dismounting from Rocinante, and grabbing his lance, he planted himself in the middle of the road, just as the licentiate, with an easy, graceful bearing and step, advanced toward Corchuelo, who came on against him, darting fire from his eyes, as the saying is. The other two of the company, the peasants, without dismounting from their asses, served as spectators of the mortal tragedy. The cuts, thrusts, downstrokes, backstrokes, and doubles that Corchuelo delivered were past counting, and came thicker than hops or hail. He attacked like an angry lion, but he was met by a tap on the mouth from the button of the licentiate's sword that checked him in the midst of his furious onset, and made him kiss it as if it were a relic, though not as devoutly as relics are and ought to be kissed. The end of it was that the licentiate reckoned up for him the thrust every one of the buttons of the short cassock he wore, tore up the skirts into strips, like the tails of a cuttlefish, knocked off his hat twice, and so completely tired him out, that in vexation, anger, and rage, he took the sword by the hilt and flung it away with such force, that one of the peasants that were there, who was a notary, and who went for it, made an affidavit afterwards that he sent it nearly 3/4 of a league, which testimony will serve, and has served, to show and establish with all certainty that strength is overcome by skill. Corchuelo sat down wearied, and Sancho approached him and said, "By my faith, señor bachelor, if your worship takes my advice, you will never challenge any one to fence again, only to wrestle and throw the bar, for you have the youth and strength for that. But as for these fencers, as they call them, I have heard say they can put the point of a sword through the eye of a needle." "I am satisfied with having tumbled off my donkey," said Corchuelo, "and with having had the truth I was so ignorant of proved to me by experience." And getting up he embraced the licentiate, and they were better friends than ever. And not caring to wait for the notary, who had gone for the sword, as they say he would be a long time about it, they resolved to push on so as to reach the village of Quiteria, to which they all belonged, in good time. During the remainder of the journey the licentiate held forth to them on the excellences of the sword, with such conclusive arguments, and such figures and mathematical proofs, that all were convinced of the value of the science, and Corchuelo cured of his dogmatism. It grew dark, but before they reached the town it seemed to them all as if there was a heaven full of countless glittering stars in front of it. They heard, too, the pleasant mingled notes of a variety of instruments, flutes, drums, psalteries, pipes, tabors, timbrels, and as they drew near they perceived that the trees of a leafy arcade that had been made constructed at the entrances of the town were filled with lights unaffected by the wind, for the breeze at the time was so gentle that it had not power to stir the leaves on the trees. The musicians were the life of the wedding, wandering through the pleasant grounds in separate bands, some dancing, others singing, others playing the various instruments already mentioned. In short, it seemed as though mirth and gaiety were frisking and gambolling all over the meadow. Several other persons were engaged in erecting raised benches from which people might conveniently see the plays and dances that were to be performed the next day on the spot dedicated to the celebration of the marriage of Camacho the Rich and the obsequies of Basilio. Don Quixote would not enter the village, although the peasant as well as the bachelor pressed him. He excused himself, however, on the grounds, amply sufficient in his opinion, that it was the custom of knights errant to sleep in the fields and woods in preference to towns, even were it under gilded ceilings, and so turned aside a little out of the road, very much against Sancho's will, as to the good quarters he had enjoyed in the castle or house of Don Diego came back to his mind. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Wherein an account is given of the wedding of Camacho the Rich, together with the incident of Basilio the Poor. Scarce had the fair Aurora given bright Phoebus time to dry the liquid pearls upon her golden locks with the heat of his fervent rays, when Don Quixote, shaking off sloth from his limbs, sprang to his feet and called to his squire Sancho, who was still snoring. Seeing which Don Quixote ere he roused him and thus addressed him: "Happy thou, above all dwellers on the face of the earth, that, without envying or being envied, sleepest with the tranquil mind, that neither enchanters persecute nor enchantments affright. Sleep, I say, and will say 100 times, without any jealous thoughts of thy mistress to make thee keep ceaseless vigils, or any cares as to how thou art to pay the debts thou owest, or find tomorrow's food for thyself and thy needy little family, to interfere with thy repose. Ambition breaks not thy rest, nor doth this world's empty pomp disturb thee, for the utmost reach of thy anxiety is to provide for thy ass, since upon my shoulders thou hast laid the support of thyself, the counterpoise and burden that nature and custom have imposed upon masters. The servant sleeps, and the master lies awake, thinking of how he is to feed him, advance him, and reward him. The distress of seeing the sky turn brazen, and withhold its needful moisture from the earth, is not felt by the servant but by the master, who in time of scarcity and famine must support him who has served him in times of plenty and abundance. To all this Sancho made no reply because he was asleep, nor would he have wakened up as soon as he did had not Don Quixote brought him to his senses with the butt of his lance. He awoke at last, drowsy and lazy, and casting his eyes about in every direction, observed, "There comes, if I don't mistake, from the quarter of that arcade a steam and a swell of a great deal more like fried rashers than galingale or thyme. A wedding that begins with smells like that, by my faith, ought to be plentiful and unstinting." "Have done, thou glutton," said Don Quixote. "Come, let us go and witness this bridal, and see what the rejected Basilio does." "Let him do what he likes," returned Sancho. "Be he not poor, he would marry Quiteria, to make a grand match for himself, and he without a farthing. Is there nothing else? Faith, señor, it's my opinion the poor man should be content with what he can get, and not go looking for dainties on the bottom of the sea. I will bet my arm for that Camacho could bury Basilio in reals, and if that be so, as no doubt it is, what a fool Quiteria would be to refuse that fine dresses and jewels Camacho must have given her and will give her, and take Basilio's bar throwing and sword play. They won't give a pint of wine at the tavern for a good cast of the bar or a neat thrust of the sword. Talents and accomplishments that can't be turned into money, lest Count Dirlos have them, but when such gives fault to one that has hard cash, I wish my condition of life was as becoming as they are. On a good fountain you can raise a good building, and the best fountain in the world is money." "For God's sake, Sancho," said Don Quixote here, "stop that harangue. It is my belief, if thou wert allowed to continue all thou beginnest every instant, thou wouldst have no time left for eating or sleeping, for thou wouldst spend it all in talking." "If your worship had a good memory," replied Sancho, "you would remember the articles of our agreement before we started from home this last time. One of them was that I was to be let say all I liked, so long as it was not against my neighbour or your worship's authority, and so far, it seems to me, I have not broken the said article." "I remember no such article, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "and even if it were so, I desire you to hold your tongue and come along, for the instruments we heard last night are already beginning to enliven the valleys again, and no doubt the marriage will take place in the cool of the morning and not in the heat of the afternoon." Sancho did as his master bade him, and putting the saddle on Rocinante and the pack saddle on Dapple, they both mounted, and at a leisurely pace entered the arcade. The first thing that presented itself to Sancho's eyes was a whole ox spitted on a whole elm tree, and in the fire at which it was to be roasted there was burning a middle-sized mountain of faggots, and 6 stew-pots that stood round the blaze had not been made in the ordinary mould of common pots, for they were 6 half wine jars, each fit to hold the contents of a slaughter-house. They swallowed up whole sheep and hid them away in their insides without showing any more sign of them than if they were pigeons. Countless were the hares ready-skinned and plucked fowls that hung on trees for burial in the pots, numberless the wild fowl and game of various sorts suspended from the branches that the air might keep them cool. Sancho counted more than 60 wineskins of over 6 gallons each, and all filled, as it proved afterwards, with generous wines. There were, besides, piles of the whitest bread, like the heaps of corn one sees on the threshing floors. There was a wall made of cheeses arranged like an open brickwork, and 2 cauldrons full of oil, bigger than those of a dyer's sheep, served for cooking fritters, which when fried were taken out with 2 mighty shovels, and plunged into another cauldron of prepared honey that stood close by. Of cooks and cook-maids there were over 50, all clean, brisk, and blithe. In the capacious belly of the ox were a dozen soft little suckling pigs, which, sewn up there, served to give it the tenderness and flavour. The spices of different kinds did not seem to have been bought by the pound but by the quarter, and all lay open to view in a great chest. In short, all the preparations made for the wedding were in rustic cycle, but abundant enough to feed an army. Sancho observed all, contemplated all, and everything won his heart. The first to captivate and take his fancy were the pots, out of which he would very gladly help himself to make a moderate pipkinful. Then the wineskins secured his affections, and lastly the produce of the frying pans, if, indeed, such imposing cauldrons may be called frying pans. And unable to control himself or bear it any longer, he approached one of the busy cooks and civilly but hungrily begged permission to soak a scrap of bread in one of the pots, to which the cook made answer, "Brother, this is not a day on which hunger is to have any sway, thanks to the rich Camacho. Get down and look about for a ladle, and skim off a hen or two, and much good may they do you." "I don't see one," said Sancho. "Wait a bit," said the cook, "sinner that I am. How particular and bashful you are." And so saying, he seized a bucket and plunging it into one of the half jars, took up 3 hens and a couple of geese, and said to Sancho, "Fall to, friend, and take the edge off your appetite with these skimmings until dinner time comes." "I have nothing to put them in," said Sancho. "Well then," said the cook, "take spoon and all, for Camacho's wealth and happiness furnish everything." While Sancho fared thus, Don Quixote was watching the entrance, at one end of the arcade, of some 12 peasants, all in holiday and gala dress, mounted on 12 beautiful mares, with rich handsome field trappings and a number of little bells attached to their petrals, who, marshalled in their regular order, ran not one but several courses over the meadow, with jubilant shouts and cries of "Long live Camacho and Quiteria! He is as rich as she is fair, and she the fairest on earth." Hearing this, Don Quixote said to himself, "It is easy to see these folk have never seen my Dulcinea del Toboso, for if they had, they would be more moderate in their praises of this Quiteria of theirs." Shortly after this, several bands of dancers of various sorts began to enter the arcade at different points, and among them one of the sword dancers composed of some 24 lads of gallant and high-spirited mien, clad in the finest and whitest of linen, and with handkerchiefs embroidered in various colours with fine silk, and one of those on the mares asked an active youth who led them if any of the dancers had been wounded. "As yet, thank God, no one has been wounded," said he, "we are all safe and sound." And he at once began to execute complicated figures with the rest of his comrades, with so many turns and so great dexterity, that although Don Quixote was well used to see dances of the same kind, he thought he had never seen any so good as this. He admired another that came in composed of fair young maidens, none of whom seemed to be under 14 or over 18 years of age, all clad in green stuff, with their locks partly braided, partly flowing loose, but all of such bright gold as to vie with the sunbeams, and over them they wore garlands of jessamine, roses, amaranth, and honeysuckle. At their head were a venerable old man and an ancient dame, more brisk and active, however, than might have been expected from their years. The notes of a Zamora bagpipe accompanied them, and with modesty in their countenances and their eyes, and lightness in their feet, they looked the best dancers in the world. Following these, there came an artistic dance of the sort they call speaking dances. It was composed of 8 nymphs in 2 files, with the god Cupid leading one and Interest the other, the former furnished with wings, bow, quiver, and arrows, the latter in a rich dress of gold and silk of divers colours. The nymphs that followed Love bore their names written on white parchment in large letters on their backs. Poetry was the name of the first, Wit of the second, Birth of the third, and Valour of the fourth. Those that followed Interest were distinguished in the same way. The badge of the first announced liberality, that of the second, largesse, the third, treasure, and the fourth, peaceful possession. In front of them all came a wooden castle drawn by 4 wild men, all clad in ivy and hemp and stained green, and looking so natural that they nearly terrified Sancho. On the front of the castle and on each of the 4 sides of its frame it bore the inscription, Castle of Caution. 4 skilful tabor and flute players accompanied them, and the dance having been opened, Cupid, after executing 2 figures, raised his eyes and bent his bow against a damsel who stood between the turrets of the castle, and thus addressed her. "I am the mighty god whose sway is potent over land and sea. The heavens above us own me. Nay, the shades below acknowledge me. I know not fear, I have my will, whatever my whim or fancy may be. For me there's no impossible. I order, bind, forbid, and set free." Having concluded the stanza, he discharged an arrow at the top of the castle, and went back to his place. Interest then came forward, and went through 2 more figures, and as soon as the tabors ceased, he said, but mightier than love am I. Though love it be that leads me on, then mine no lineage is more high, or older underneath the sun. To use me rightly few know how, to act without me fewer still, for I am Interest, and I vow for evermore to do thy will. Interest retired, and Poetry came forward, and when she had gone through her figures like the others, fixing her eyes on the damsel of the castle, she said, "With many a fanciful conceit, fair lady, winsome Poesy her soul, an offering at thy feet, presents in sonnets unto thee. If thou my homage wilt not scorn, thy fortune, watched by envious eyes, on wings of poesy upborne, shall be exalted into the skies." Poetry withdrew, and on the side of interest liberality advanced, and after having gone through her figures, said, "To give, while shunning each extreme, the sparing hand, the overfree, therein consists, so wise men deem, the virtue liberality. But thee, fair lady, go enrich, myself a prodigal I'll prove, of vice not wholly shameful, which may find its fair excuse in love." In the same manner all the characters of the two bands advanced and retired, and each executed its figures, and delivered its verses, some of them graceful, some burlesque, but Don Quixote's memory, though he had an excellent one, only carried away those that have just been quoted. All then mingled together, forming chains and breaking off again with graceful, unconstrained gaiety, and whenever Love passed in front of the castle he shot his arrows up at it, while Interest spoke gilded pellets against it. At length, after they had danced a good while, Interest drew out a great purse, made of the skin of a large brindled cat, and to all appearance full of money, and flung it at the castle, and with the full force of the blow, the boards fell asunder and tumbled down, leaving the damsel exposed and unprotected. Interest and the characters of his band advanced, and throwing a great chain of gold over her neck pretended to take her and lead her away captive, on seeing which, Love and his supporters made as though they would release her, the whole action being to the accompaniment of the tabors and the form of regular dance. The wild men made peace between them, and with great dexterity readjusted and fixed the boards of the castle, and the damsel once more ensconced herself within, and with this the dance wound up, to the great enjoyment of the beholders. Don Quixote asked one of the nymphs who it was that had composed and arranged it. She replied that it was the beneficiary of the town who had a nice taste in devising things of the sort. "I will lay a wager," said Don Quixote, "that the same bachelor or beneficiary is a greater friend of Camacho's than of Basilio's, and that he is better at satire than at vespers. He has introduced the accomplishments of Basilio and the riches of Camacho very neatly into the dance." Sancho Panza, who was listening to all this, exclaimed, "The king is my cock, I stick to Camacho." "It is easy to see thou art a clown, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "and one of that sort that cry, 'Long life to the conqueror.'" "I don't know what sort I am," returned Sancho, "but I know very well I'll never get such elegant skimmings off Basilio's pots as those I have got off Camacho's," and he showed him the bucketful of geese and hens, and seizing one began to eat with great gaiety and appetite, saying, "A fig for the accomplishments of Basilio! As much as thou hast, so much art thou worth, and as much as thou art worth, so much hast thou. As a grandmother of mine used to say, there are only two families in the world, the haves and the haven'ts, and she stuck to the haves, and to this day, Señor Don Quixote, people would sooner feel the pulse of have than of no. An ass covered with gold looks better than a horse with a pack saddle. So once more I say stick to Camacho, the bountiful skimmings of whose pots are geese and hens, hares and rabbits, but of Basilio's, if any ever come to hand, or even to foot, they'll be only rinsings." "Hast thou finished thy harangue, Sancho?" said Don Quixote. "Of course I have finished it," replied Sancho, "because I see your worship takes offence at it; but if it was not for that, there was work enough cut out for 3 days." "God grant I may see thee dumb before I die, Sancho," said Don Quixote. "At the rate we are going," said Sancho, "I'll be chewing clay before your worship dies, and then, maybe, I'll be so dumb that I'll not say a word until the end of the world, or, at least, till the day of judgment." "Even should that happen, O Sancho," said Don Quixote, "thy silence will never come up to all thou hast talked, art talking, and wilt talk all thy life. Moreover, it naturally stands to reason that my death will come before thine. So I never expect to see thee dumb, not even when thou art drinking or sleeping, and that is the utmost I can say." "In good faith, señor," replied Sancho, "there's no trusting that fleshless one, I mean Death, who devours the lamb as soon as the sheep, and, as I have heard our curate say, treads with equal foot upon the lofty towers of kings and the lowly huts of the poor. That lady is more mighty than dainty, she is no way squeamish, and she devours all that is ready for all, and fills her alforjas with people of all sorts, ages, and ranks. She is no reaper that sleeps out the noontide, and at all times she is reaping and cutting down, as well the dry grass as the green. She never seems to chew, but bolts and swallows all that is put before her, for she has a canine appetite that is never satisfied. And although she has no belly, she shows that she has a dropsy, and is athirst to drink the lives of all that live, as one would drink a jug of cold water." "Say no more, Sancho," said Don Quixote at this. "Don't try to better it, and risk a fall. For in truth, what thou hast said about death in thy rustic phrase is what a good preacher might have said. I tell thee, Sancho, if thou hadst discretion equal to thy mother wit, thou mightst take a pulpit in hand, and go about the world preaching fine sermons." "He preaches well who lives well," said Sancho, "and I know no more theology than that." "Nor needst thou," said Don Quixote, "but I cannot conceive or make out how it is that, the fear of God being the beginning of wisdom, thou, who art more afraid of a lizard than of him, knowest so much." "Pass judgment on your chivalries, señor," returned Sancho, "and don't set yourself up to judge of other men's fears or braveries, for I am as good a fearer of God as my neighbours. But leave me to dispatch these skimmings, for all the rest is only idle talk that we shall be called to account for in the other world." And so saying, he began a fresh attack on the bucket, with such a hearty appetite that he aroused Don Quixote's, who no doubt would have helped him had he not been prevented by what must be told farther on. End of chapter 20. Recording by Jamie Strassenberg, Cypress, California, www.cooljamie.com.